So one of the primary motivations that psychologists like to look at is hunger. Hunger we've briefly talked about in relation to the drive reduction theory, but now what we're going to do is we're going to go into a little bit more detail about how hunger is created, how the feeling of being full is created, sort of how does this prototypical motivation function in terms of the body. So one of the first really big studies into hunger, what it looked like, what the effects of it were, what it did to a person psychologically, physiologically, was conducted by Ansel Keys. This study is known as the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. And the whole point of this experiment was actually to study hunger from a scientific perspective with the end goal of gaining information that could be helpful at the end of World War II. The United States conducted this study, that's why it's called the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, and they were preparing themselves for the end of a war where troops might be encountering individuals and populations who had been under periods of semi-starvation for quite some time during wartime over in Europe and Asia. And the United States military kind of just wanted to know what to expect. So 36 volunteers took part in this experiment, all of whom were what we call conscientious objectors, who hadn't served in combat during the war because it was against their faith, against their conscience. However, they still wanted to be patriots and they still wanted to serve their country in some way. And so by taking part in this experiment, that's their way they saw of contributing to the cause and to the nation. So the experiment lasted about 6 weeks and it involved undergoing a period of semi-starvation, I believe having their normal, cutting in half their normal caloric intake. And the results were maybe to be expected. The men involved in the study began conserving their energy without even meaning to. They became slower, they became sluggish. They started to just conserve all of their resources inside their body because their body was realizing, ooh, we don't have like a steady stream of energy coming in. They also, as Maslow would have predicted from his hierarchy, became super preoccupied with food. A lot of the men had families, had wives. They weren't interested in, hanging out with their fam or doing romantic things with their spouses. All they wanted to do was talk about food and read cookbooks and go to restaurants and stare at food. Food really took over their entire psychological self. And so what this experiment really shows is that in some ways, Maslow's hierarchy is accurate when it comes to food. When someone is deprived of food, they do start to just think about it all the time, more so than usual. So this was the first study to really look at hunger. There are all sorts of other findings based on what happened to the body, what happened to distribution of fat, and all that kind of stuff. But really big idea here is just people are starting to empirically study hunger. So some of the stuff that we're going to talk about next builds off of this kind of approach. So you can look at hunger from two perspectives, and the Minnesota Starvation Experiment sort of touched on both of them. But you can look at the physiology of hunger, what's happening in the body, and then you can also look at the psychology of hunger, what's happening in the mind. Well, for this presentation, we're really just going to look at the physiology. And we're going to start with a really weird study conducted by Washburn and Cannon. I'm sure you've heard the idea before that, like, when you're hungry, your stomach growls. That's something we've encountered before. And Washburn and Cannon wanted to know, well, that growling or that movement of the stomach, is that what's actually creating feelings of hunger? When our stomach contracts, is that then sending a physiological message to our brain, hey, we're hungry? So what Washburn and Cannon did is they first wanted to even see, is there a correlation between feelings of hunger and these stomach pangs? And so in order to do that, Washburn actually ended up swallowing a balloon that was attached to a device that would measure what was happening to the balloon. The reason why this would be helpful at all is because when he swallowed the balloon, it ended up in his stomach, and then the balloon was inflated so that the outside of the balloon was right up against the lining of the stomach. So every single time the stomach contracted, the balloon would also contract. And then you can see in this image here that the balloon was connected to a device externally, probably not a very comfortable experiment to run, that would measure every time the balloon, therefore the stomach, contracted. Washburn also would take note of every single time he felt hungry. He had another monitoring device where he'd click a button every time he felt hungry. And what the findings of the study were is that there was a correlation between stomach contractions and feelings of hunger. However, correlation is not causation. So what happens in situations where stomach contractions don't exist? Is the stomach the only thing that's driving hunger pangs? Well, the answer kind of has to be no. Couple of reasons. One, your stomach contracts at other times. Yeah, it does contract oftentimes when you're feeling hungry, but it also contracts sometimes just for funsies. Other more scientific approaches to answering this question involved the surgical removal of stomachs in different types of lab animals, rats, for example. When you remove their stomach, they still feel hungry, they still seek out food, so therefore their stomach contracting can't be the only thing that's causing them to feel hunger. Individuals who have had to have portions or all of their stomach removed for reasons maybe like cancer, they still report feeling hungry. So clearly the stomach contractions aren't the really big answer. So what is the answer? Well, where research is pointing now for like the real best physiological basis for hunger would be the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus we've encountered before. We've learned that the hypothalamus is your body reward center, that it might be implicated in addictions, that it is in charge of bodily maintenance, and it talks to the endocrine system. Well, what that really means is that the hypothalamus actually receives input from all of your different bodily systems. There are receptors in your stomach, in your liver, in your intestines, in all of your digestive system, really, that are going to monitor levels of the blood flowing through them and going to report back to the hypothalamus about where those levels are. What this means is your hypothalamus is receiving somewhat real-time feedback about where your blood chemistry is. Keep in mind your blood chemistry is heavily affected by what you eat. And so the hypothalamus really does monitor hunger signals. Now, there are actually two different portions to your hypothalamus. If we look here, we can see that you actually have a lateral hypothalamus and you have a ventromedial hypothalamus. And research has demonstrated that while the hypothalamus overall, we can say, is involved in the hunger drive, there's actually more specificity that we can get into. So if we start with the lateral hypothalamus, those are the sides of the hypothalamus. And what researchers have found is that when you stimulate the lateral hypothalamus, hunger is created. So when that portion of the hypothalamus is active, we feel hungry. How? Well, the hypothalamus triggers the release of different chemicals. Specifically, if your blood sugar drops, orexin is released, and orexin is going to be a hunger-creating hormone. The ventromedial hypothalamus, or the VMH, as you might call it, is the lower to middle section of your hypothalamus, and this one is involved in kind of like the flip side of hunger. We feel hungry, but we also feel full, and both of those are really, really important feelings for the proper maintenance of the hunger drive. Well, stimulation of the VMH is what's going to cause that feeling of fullness, otherwise known as satiety. The word to satiate means to satisfy. And so satiety is that feeling of satisfaction you have when you're full, like you've had a good meal and your brain then lets you know, hey, you're good, you don't need any more food right now, like you can feel satisfied. Psychologists have done lots of different studies on looking at the lateral and ventromedial hypothalamus. Some of them involve stimulation. So stimulation of lateral creates hunger, stimulation of ventromedial creates satiety, but they've also done studies involving the lesioning or the destruction of these parts of the brain. And what you're looking at here are two different images of what's colloquially known as the VMH rat, the ventromedial hypothalamus rat, which is somewhat a misnomer. here because this rat's actually missing his ventromedial hypothalamus, and you can see clearly how the rat has become obese. The rat is much larger than normal rats are, and the reason for this is its brain never sends it that feeling of being full. So it eats and it eats and it eats and it eats because it's lacking that ventromedial hypothalamus.